I want to thank, first of all, Carol Stewart for sharing her fabulous work with us. As you see, it surrounds us and it's so beautiful. And I want to thank our friends at Hammond Harkins, who are truly good friends. Marlena and Laura and Chet isn't here, but Nikki's here. They've been wonderful in helping us install the show, and just their presence is very, very welcomed. I think Carol had just a few words she wanted to say before we get going.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I really, really appreciate you being here. And I want to speak up because my husband's doing this. So I want to thank the German Village Society, Carol Genschaft, for inviting me to do this, and to all of the art committee. And Betsy, thank you for that. It's really nice. And to thank Marlena and Hammond Harkins for all the help and support with the show. They're absolutely amazing to work with, and I appreciate that so much. I also want to thank the Ohio Arts Council and the Greater Columbus Arts Council for their support.
So before we get started, I thought I'd give a very, very brief outline of the history of still life in art over the years, because then you'll see kind of where Carol's work fits in. So still life painting is really an ancient art, as demonstrated by Greek and Roman frescoes and mosaics that date from the 1st century and even before. In fact, right now at the Columbus Museum of Art, we have an exhibition of ancient glass, ancient Roman glass from about the 1st century. And we have a reproduction of a wall painting from Herculaneum of glasses and fruit that is really a wonderful still life, and shows the artist's skill in depicting transparency. And actually, he or she, probably he then, depicted glass even filled with liquid, so really quite stunning. And then some of you might remember the large floor mosaic that we had from Israel a couple years ago. And that too had lots of animals, but it also had a number of vignettes of still life arrangements. So the whole tradition of still life is really quite old. In fact, there's a Greek myth or a Greek legend about two painters who were having a competition to see how realistic they could paint something. And that really is the background for what's called trompe-l'oeil still life, which has just, I think, challenged artists throughout the ages to depict things that on a two-dimensional surface that looks so real that you think they really are, be it currency or a postage stamp or some kind of document. So then, even in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, there were a lot of still lifes produced. A lot of those had religious symbolism in them. The Dutch artists of about the 17th century produced vanitas paintings, which had moral tales in them and often were about the brevity of life. And there were kind of symbols of skulls and burning candles that would kind of, help people understand the message there. And then around the 17th century, academies of art began to be established in France and in other countries. And then, unfortunately, still life got the bad end of that deal, because they established this hierarchy of art. And in that hierarchy, if a painting didn't have a person in it, it was kind of on the lowest rung. And that's where still lifes really came in, and above them were history paintings, religious paintings, mythological paintings, anything with a very dramatic scene in it. So still life kind of got this reputation of being not so important. But when we look back, we see that that didn't really keep artists from painting still lifes, and from viewers for really being fascinated by them and really enjoying them. Even with the rise of abstract expressionism in the 20th century, when kind of representational art was out of fashion, artists again continued to do really interesting still lifes as they do today. I think the 19th century artist, Edouard Manet, had the best words about still life. He said that a painter really could say all he wants to say just by painting flowers or fruit or even clouds. And then he went on to say that he believed that still life painting still lifes were the touchstone of painting. So I think on that note, with establishing how much still life has meant through the ages, we can start talking about Carol's wonderful still lifes. And I thought I'd begin by just asking her to fill us in a little bit about her life, how she came to be this wonderful still life artist. I think you arrived here in Columbus around 2012. Mm-hmm. So maybe if you fill us in what happened before and what brought you here.
Okay.
That will get us started.
So my husband and I are both Canadian, and I graduated in 1981 with a BFA from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, which is the town I'm from. And then after that, Paul and I moved to England. And during that time, I worked as a florist and I grew gardens, and really in England started doing paintings of gardens. And mostly in the summer I'd paint gardens, and then during the winter time I would paint still life. So I have this love of growing things and flowers. Then we moved to Vancouver, British Columbia, and then to St. Louis, where we lived for 20 years. So while we were in St. Louis, I spent 10 years doing an MA and an MFA at Fontbonne University, where I worked with very traditional painting techniques and learned all of the things I didn't learn way back when in my BFA. So that was a great experience to be able to do this slowly over 10 years. And then, so that finished in about 2010, and then we came here in 2012. And so almost everything here has been painted in Columbus except for the lantern painting, which was done in St. Louis. It was part of a series I did based on photographs I took in Chinatown in San Francisco.
And well, tell us about Paul for a minute. We won't leave him out. Is that really what brought you to Columbus?
We came to Columbus because of Paul Goodfellow taking a job at the James Cancer Center. He's a geneticist and cancer researcher. He mostly works on women's cancers.
Great. Well, we're very glad to have both of you. I guess a question I would love to have you talk about a little bit is how you accumulate the objects in your paintings, how you choose them, what attracts you to them. Do many of the objects have special stories that go with them? And if they do, maybe you could share a few with us. Just talk about kind of the objects in the paintings.
Okay. So I'm kind of a stuff kind of person, and I see things and I'm like, that might be good, and I'll be at someone's house for dinner and I'm like, I can't take my eye off that thing, and then I talk them into loaning it to me. And sometimes they just give up and say, oh, well, just keep it. You've had it for 12 years, and so I'll keep it. So, we go to junk stores, we go to antique stores, I buy things on Etsy. Like recently I've started putting these ceramic birds into it, the green painting at the back. The parrot came from the Grandview Mercantile, and the other birds came from Hungary. So I have a painting I'm working on now that has a milk pitcher that sat on my table as a child. It's striped, and so I like the patterns, but it reminds me, of my mother and our childhood home, and different things that people have loaned and given to me. I think about those people when I'm painting those things. So, and the flowers, plants, I grow a lot in our garden. We have a huge garden at home, and then at Milo Arts, where my studio is, I have a big garden there too, which drives Paul crazy. I have so much gardening going on. But it seems like the paintings have more life when there's something living in them, a piece of fruit or a flower. It doesn't have to be a lot, but it gives it a softer line and different kind of texture. So, but I look for colors, and I love painting glass. Glass is something, so I have tons of different glass pieces in my studio. I love the reflections, and people always say, oh, it's so hard to paint glass, but for me, that's the easy part. The hard part in a painting for me are the empty spaces, like the background. But the glass is really fun.
That's great. Do you, when you travel, do you look for things?
I do. Okay, so when we went to India, there's all kinds of fabrics and colors and patterns and textiles. I came home with a whole suitcase full of things. And in Jaipur, we went to a paper factory, and I bought paper-covered boxes, and then I started putting these boxes. There's a couple paintings that have the boxes in them. So a lot of, yeah, whenever we travel, and it's fun, you know, when you travel, and then as you get older, you stop acquiring things, but for me, it's like an excuse to buy something you love to bring home.
That's great.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about how you arrange things? Like, I'm wondering, like, do you have an idea in mind, like a big picture, and then you start to put it together, or do the objects kind of, you start and they grow and it's kind of gradual, and then my big question is, how do you know when to stop? How do you know when there's enough stuff in there? And do you always paint what you've set up as a still life or as composed, or do you make a lot of changes along the way?
So when I'm working on a painting, I have about 5 or 6 different tables in my studio. So I have different setups going on, and so while I'm working on, and I might have a couple paintings going at the same time because of the light, but I'll be working on another still life setup, and I'll kind of be looking at it out of the corner of my eye and moving things around, or I might have a new textile or a new piece of glass, and so I'll be kind of getting used to that and figuring out what works with that, what feels, but most of it is about how it feels. It feels right together, and I guess that would be how it would go. I brought this painting that I'm working on now. So it's about probably 80% finished. And so the idea in the beginning was I had this light colored tabletop, and I had these different elements. This little spotted cup here with the hellebores, which are from they're winter blooming in our garden. There's a small painting over there that has the same cup in it, which was painted right before this painting. This painting didn't have this stripe in it from the beginning. It had this rolled up piece of Japanese fabric that I cut off of a kimono, but nothing was holding the painting together. It just wasn't held together. And so after mostly all the objects were in there, I thought, so I put this striped piece of cloth in there, and then that held the whole thing, and it worked. So when you ask me if things change, yes, and probably there's a couple objects that were taken out, and actually this wasn't in there in the beginning either. That got added in after the cloth. So it just needed a bigger shape. So yeah, things get moved around, taken out. Sometimes I'll crop a painting, sometimes I might do a big painting like this, and I decide, oh, really I was only interested in that little bit, and the rest of it goes, so.
So
yeah.
Will you add any objects to this one, for example?
I don't know, I think this is pretty much set. There'll be some minor changes, but it's getting close to finished. Most of the paintings are on paper, and I work on 300-pound hot press watercolor paper, and the hot press, and it's thick like cardboard. The hot press part means that it's very smooth. And I like to paint on that because it can take the dry mediums of Conte or charcoal or pastels, whereas when I work on a canvas, once you get the oil on there, you can't add those other dry mediums as easily. It kind of slips around. And also with the paper, I don't have to decide how big it's going to be. Like, I could start out this big, and it could end up this big in the end. Like, I could chop that little bit out, and it'd be a nice painting just by itself. So I never start on white, because if you have something white, your eye doesn't really gauge how big it is. So having colors on here, I think my eye can read better what the size is. And then when I'm mixing my paints at the end of the day on the paper palette, I'll take that sheet and I'll print it all over a piece of paper. And so it's kind of like a monoprint, and it has a certain energy and movement and texture to it that I think finds its way into the energy of the whole painting. So in this painting here, you can see, like, This reddish orange here is probably coming through from the background. And so it adds another layer to the painting before I start.
Do you
And then-
typically draw the image that you would see, or do you just paint in color blocks?
Both.
Both.
I do both, yeah. You can see on this one this is Conte here, which is a stick of pigment basically. So you can see the drawing marks on this painting. And I like that, the different textures of the drawing medium and the paint. Yeah.
And so when you do this, kind of make a monoprint almost, would you use this for a background, for a ground?
Yeah, this is how it starts.
So this one might have started kind of like that.
Oh, it did. So the thing about paper, I won't take it all the way off, but
Here.
you can see.
Yep.
So at some point I decided to crop this piece of paper and make it smaller.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And you just came up with this technique kind of yourself. It's not something you particularly learned in art school.
Well, in art school, a lot of painters talk about painting on top of old paintings. Like one time during my master's, I said to Victor, who's the painter I worked with mostly, I said, I have stacks of paintings that are no good. And he said, you're so lucky. You have all these paintings to paint over. So if you paint over a painting, you have all this beautiful random color and mark making underneath. But sometimes that can be very heavy too. It'll be too solid. And I'm very interested in transparency in my work. So this kind of allows me to have that feeling of painting on another painting, but not having the heaviness of that. I don't like oil paintings when they have the same amount of solid finish across the whole painting. Some painters will have the same amount of white in all their paint and becomes very chalky or something. I like there to be a lot of variety in the mark making, and I like the painting to look good from far away, but when you get up close, that there's lots of layering of the paint and mark making that will hold your interest over time. The green and white is an umbrella that I snagged from the office at Milo. It's really old and it's kind of beautiful. And I had that laying on the table, and I thought about having the yellow. I don't always use a lot of yellow in my still life paintings, but that has a mirror behind it. So there's a reflection, and I didn't put the frame of the mirror, so a lot of people don't see that right away, that it's a reflection.
Cool.
The pansies for me are like little characters. They're my people replacement, I guess. I didn't answer your other question about how do you know when to stop. That's the worst. That's the worst part of painting, is knowing when to stop. You just don't know. And when you have an exhibition like this, it kind of forces you to finish a few things. So
do you ever feel like, well, it's time, I have to stop?
yes. And sometimes I feel like I pushed a painting too far, and maybe it got overworked, or I think most artists would tell you that's the hardest part, is knowing when to stop.
How long do you spend on one painting?
Oh, that's a really hard question, because as long as they're in my studio, I keep going back to them and tweaking them and changing weeks or months. Or once I've decided the size, so this one was cropped on the top, so the piece of paper is bigger, then I'll order a panel from a carpenter who makes the panels for me. And then I'll mount the paper on the panel and finish the edges. So if you look at it, it just looks like oil on panel. You wouldn't know that there was paper. But the paper has this beautiful surface that I can't get on the panel. So I make life really difficult for myself by doing this process.
Interesting. So you said you might, for example, cut out part of a painting. What happens to the rest?
Strips like this. Yeah. Or I might paint something else on top of it. If there's a big enough piece left, I might do something else with it. Or sometimes I might end up with 2 paintings out of one. So I've always had my studio at home until we moved to Columbus. And Paul would come home from work and we would drink wine and then we would crop paintings.
Sounds like fun.
I have these huge windows that face south and I get this beautiful sunshine that comes in. That's the best, when the real sunshine falls on the painting. When I don't have it in the right place, I have some lights, I can kind of mimic it. But like this painting you asked me, that beautiful light falling on the side of that white pansy, that's real sun coming in. And so for crucial parts of the painting like that, I'll wait till I have that to paint the light.
Interesting. Could you talk a minute about where some of your inspiration comes from? Are there artists, you know, throughout the ages who have influenced you, or not so much?
I think it's a really lucky time to be an artist now because we have so many resources. So Richard Diebenkorn is an artist. I love his representational period. In fact, that's one of his paintings in the background of that green painting. It's a landscape taken out of one of his paintings. That solved my background problem in that. But in reading about Richard Diebenkorn, he had to write and have catalogs sent to him. And for him to go to shows in other places was a big ordeal. And now we have all of this. So that's one artist I love. I love Vuillard. I was just up at the Chicago Art Institute that has several really wonderful ones. Bonnard, Matisse, of course. So artists with color. I love David Hockney. He's fun and adventurous. And there's a lot of Canadian artists I follow too that you probably don't know. Yeah. So, but now there's this richness going on. So there's different centers, like in Philadelphia with the Pennsylvania Academy. There's many representational artists coming out of these schools, and we're all connected online on Instagram mostly, and it's wonderful.
Do you have anything that you are hoping to do that you haven't done yet? Or maybe visit some place for inspiration, or use some object that you haven't quite found?
I really want to go on some other trips. I want to go to Turkey and Morocco and Indonesia, all these places that have patterns and color I want to visit. So we're going to start doing those things, right?
Sounds good.
So, but in some ways with my painting, I always feel like I'm just getting started, and I've been painting for like 40 years, but I really feel like I'm just getting there. I'm just starting to get there. That's how it feels. And so it's exciting, and I feel very lucky to have this passion in my life because I don't ever have to retire, and I'll always have something to do. I'm just driven to make that next best painting. It's what I do. I get up and I think about my art, and I read about some art and think about it, and then I paint. And when I don't paint for a couple of weeks, I get really weird. Yeah, I get like uncomfortable and agitated. And 5 hours is about the maximum I could do. I mean, if any of you do writing or something like that, you would think you probably couldn't write for more than 5 hours in a day. You would have to break it up with other things. So, but once I'm doing that 5 hours, I don't take very long breaks. I don't go out for lunch or do anything. I have to have that 5 hours has to be uninterrupted. And it's really peaceful and quiet at Milo.
Have you seen your work kind of evolve over the 40 years?
Oh, for sure.
Did you start out doing still life, or was that something?
Still life from the beginning. And when I was in art school, everybody painted abstract, and I was very much dismissed. And I didn't learn a lot about techniques. I had to get there on my own, and it was a struggle with my confidence to feel like, yeah, what I do is just fine. It's good. It feels right to me. Although I did have a couple of teachers that were educated at the Slade, in London. And one of them went to school with Ewan Uglow, if any of you know his work. He's an amazing still life painter, dead now, but. And also you might want to know that Maurice Denis is kind of my academic great-great-grandfather. He taught Andre Beeler, who's a famous Canadian artist who taught the teacher who taught me, the one from the Slade that taught me. So.
It's the turtle view of art history. I had a professor in college who said, you know, all of art history is really just this row, piles of turtles. One is, you know, leaning on the one below, and that's the way it goes.
Yeah, and when I put other artists' work in the background of my painting, it's like a thank you and a nod to the artists that came before me. This painting, I have a book propped open that has 2 Matisse paintings in the background. And Rick Borg's here, I've put one of his paintings in the background of mine. Yeah. So living in St. Louis for 20 years, I didn't have a gallery that represented me, but I do and still do have galleries in other cities that I work with. So I promoted my own work for 20 years in St. Louis. So I'm very used to doing that and making connections with people and putting on my own exhibitions either in our house or in a place like this. So when I came to Columbus, I thought, well, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. And then I met Marlena and she offered to take my work. And I was, oh, I didn't really think about doing something like that, but yeah, let's do it. And it's been fantastic. It's so I still can do some of the things I do, but it's really freed me up to focus a lot more on my painting a body of work and developing my work. And it's been a fantastic relationship. And they're a gallery that really, really supports their artists, but they don't tell their artists what to paint or what to do. Like some galleries are like, well, that's saleable, paint me 5 more of those. And there's nothing like that. It's very professional, and it's a very good relationship.
Didn't you do a series with children's toys?
Yes, I did a few with children's toys.
Which were different.
So we had a grandchild born last year, and so I started hauling all these toys out of the basement I had saved. That was kind of fun.
Maybe as a final question, what do you hope people will walk away with having seen your work?
So I really like what I do, and I think people can feel that happiness and joy in my work. And I feel like I make paintings that can hold your interest over time, that there's a lot of work in them and a lot of detail that will hold your interest over time. I don't know, each painting is different. Some of them have a real quiet intensity to them, like I think this one is doing that, and the large blue one, it has a quiet intensity, but a joy and a beauty, and I think we need that right now in our life.
I guess on the other side of that, have you ever been tempted to include anything that would be kind of more contemporary, newsworthy, any kind of political communication or something that's important to you?
Not in my work, I can't do that. I used to listen to NPR a lot while I painted, but the last couple of years I just, it just makes me agitated. So when I paint, I have to be really peaceful and really solid in myself. I have to know that my kids are okay and that the laundry's done. It's like,
Our committee has had lots of exhibitions here, but this one just makes me smile. So
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.